1969. What a number. What a year. Wars, peace, love, music, drugs, racing, stopwatches, automatic chronographs. For those of us who have lived under a rock and don't know how this watch originated, here is the basic rundown of the story. Zenith was in competition with a handful of other manufacturers, Seiko and Hoya, to create the world's first automatic chronograph. And they were so sure that they were going to be the first, they named their watch El Primero. It so happens that they weren't, and in fact were beaten by Hoya, who released the now iconic Monochrome. The watch has been affiliated to Steve McQueen and Le Mans ever since, and it technically was the first automatic chronograph ever created, but that is a topic that is still hotly debated even today. We have seen this before in other situations. In fact, around the same time, Rolex and their Daytona, before it was outdone by the Speedmaster as the space watch, Rolex had called their chronograph a cosmograph. Whoops. But instead of scrapping the name and their hubris, the El Primero remained, and now sits as one of the greatest chronographs in the world, and one I believe to be the only chronograph you would ever need to own. So before looking at the design of the watches in detail, we should browse through the technical specifications that the El Primero offers, because the watch's movement calibers have become legendary, and even to this day offer a lot more than what their competition brings to the table. This subject has always been widely debated, comparing column wheel to cam wheel chronographs. In my limited experience, I've noticed that column wheels are smoother to operate. From a design point of view, I find the complication more fascinating than cams, and even though they are more traditional, they are still greatly appreciated by the majority. What made the El Primero movement famous was the ingenious idea of making it automatic. The approach had never been done successfully before, and chronographs generally were always hand-wound. Even nowadays, some of the most valuable high horology pieces in the world, like the Patek Philippe reference 5170 or the A. Lange & Söhne 1815 chronograph, still opt to use manual wind chronographs. That is partly because the approach is more traditional, again, but also because incorporating an automatic rotor is a difficult feat. Not only does the integrated module require space, but the mechanical architecture has to somehow keep out of the way of the rotor. Some brands opt to use micro rotors to wind movements, but with most automatic chronographs you find a full rotor is used on the outside of the movement because space is such an issue. To simplify it, an automatic chronograph caliber is a phenomenal movement on any watch. The hardest part of the process is making a movement thin enough to incorporate both the automatic rotor, but also the complexity of the components underneath. We find horror stories of movements requiring two calibers to be stacked on top of each other, which increases the piece's overall thickness. Essentially, creating integrated automatic chronographs is a feat that many have tried and failed to do. And nowadays there are only a handful of watches worth their salt in this arena. And that then leads to beat rates. Chronographs are all about accuracy. They are built in such a way to help the user calculate elapsed time to the millisecond. What limits the watch's ability to calculate this elapsed time accurately is the stroke of the hand every second. Any mechanical watch, no matter how close you look at it, has some form of stutter to its hand as it sweeps the dial. This is the beauty of mechanics. No matter how small the cog or how many teeth it possesses, there will always be some kind of stutter that the hand experiences. Some pieces are so smooth nowadays that these stutters can only be seen under a microscope and not by the naked eye. This is all about beat rate. The greater the stutter, the less beat rate the movement has. And the less smooth the chronograph hand is on the dial, the less accurate the reading is to the millisecond. Think of it like a car with revolutions per minute. Watches use the term VPH, vibrations per hour. Watches can beat anywhere from 18,000, 2.5 Hz, 21,600, 3 Hz, 28,800, 4 Hz, and more, or less. And this is all dependent on their movements. Chronographs of the 60s were still using beat rates of 18,000 and 21,600. Rolex chronographs of the time were using a beat rate of 19,800. Then the El Primero arrived with a beat rate of 36,000 vibrations per hour, absolutely demolishing the sweep of other pieces during the time. So in summary, the El Primero arrived with one of the first, never-before-seen automatic column wheel chronograph calibers. Not only was the caliber able to self-wind, but it also had the ability to operate at a frequency that only a few watches had experimented with at the time. This made the time-telling function more accurate to the millisecond. The movement consisted of 36 joules, an excellent number. The more joules a movement has, the less friction the parts experience, and a 50-hour power reserve. That alone is a reason why anyone should consider this watch, because even today, their movements are still referred to as one of the greatest calibers ever made. And when we consider that Zenith chronograph movements were used in a variety of watches throughout the 70s until the 90s, yes, the famed Rolex Zenith Daytonas, the caliber is a testament to its capability. Accurate, reliable, hard-wearing, brilliant. With these specifics out of the way, we can now move our focus towards the design of the watch and its distinctive characteristics. Let's begin by looking at the vintage pieces. I mean, what needs to be said? The reference A384 is a stunning photograph of the time when it was made. Its period-correct styled case that is brushed and angled around the square shape allows for a rounded dial to sit inside the space. It is gorgeous, and sized at 37mm, the watch has serious character. As we will see with all the pieces, contrast dictates the El Primero's design language, and we can see how evident it is here with one of the earlier references. The scale and proportions of the subdials, how their presence is not overpowering, and also adds so much to the dial. The inset tachymeter and how it connects to the minute track, just the simplicity of placing the date window in the corner was a forward-thinking approach at the time. The reference A386 is an example that is more in line with the modern piece we see today. It adopts a more modern case shape and size, and yes, we will get to its use of colors in a moment. And one of the best examples, my personal favorite, is the reference G381. If you ever wanted a chronograph to end your collecting, this one is a brilliant contender. It is the outward simplicity that we see at first. The gold, highlighting against the stark white dial and black subdials, paired with a black tachymeter ring. Then the iconic red seconds hand ties it all together. And within it, you see all of the complexity of the minute track scales and the retro styling of the indices and hands. You just cannot find chronographs like these nowadays. For me, this reference is the epitome of the El Primero. I would even go so far to say, a king of chronographs. Now to the modern pieces. We have seen many different iterations over the years, but in keeping with the timeline, the focus will be on the 38 and 42mm examples that are offered. Then we will look at some experimental pieces. What defines the typical El Primero we see nowadays? I bet that any enthusiast would be able to spot it across a room because of how the subdials on the pieces have been arranged. The steel grey, charcoal, and blue combination has elevated the design of this watch into the history books. Notice also how these subdials actually overlap each other on certain models. And too often, we find that chronographs are built to remain as basic and plain as possible. Sure, a safer design would appeal to more people, but when every design is safe, well, watches become more regimented. And when there is no character, they collectively lose something special about them. More and more, we see that the subdials on these El Primero pieces have become the defining feature, and that is fantastic. It's a simple approach, but also one that hammers home the idea that the piece is a chronograph first and a watch second. The breaking up of the colors gives the watch more visual complexity, but it also allows for the eye to move from left to right. Now admittedly, the tricolor layout does not appeal to everyone. I for one find it cluttering at times. The variety of colors makes the watch look interesting, but if you aren't a fan of the combination, then they can appear jarring. What it does do is keep the aesthetic of the watch rooted in the 70s, and that is always commendable. Now if we focus on the piece, the question is, does the layout of the modern El Primero work? Does it still hold up today? Are the colors on the subdials too distracting? I think what saves the watch and brings the three dials together is the red seconds hand. If we were to take 4 circles and color them the same as the subdials, but color the top circle the same as the seconds hand, you can see that there is a relationship that they all share. It's a bold move to handle color theory like this, but also it surprisingly does work. As for the design layout of the dial, it is good to see well thought out space allocation. The subdials are there, but are not overpowering in size. There is enough space allowance for the indices to be set at every marker, and they take up a very reasonable amount of space, Once again, like I've mentioned in many videos before, space and proportion on a dial is so important. And what we can see here is a correct understanding of sizes and ratios. The dial doesn't look empty, but it also doesn't look cluttered. A balance has been found. I cannot tell you how much I appreciate the attention to detail that has gone into the placement of the date window. Most models you will see have the windows set between 4 and 5, and others have them set at the 6 o'clock position. Another model that has become popular is the open work El Primero that shows you the balance wheel and the mechanics working in the background. The model visually works best in a rose gold configuration. In a standard steel case, it appears quite cluttered and difficult to read, at least on first impressions. In the El Primero line, we have seen so many fantastic examples. One that really caught my eye is the reference 020500. Just on aesthetics alone, it has such character. The needle hands, the hour markers, the triangles at the quarters, and the neatly placed window. The square pushers on the case also look fantastic, and the piece seems like it originated in the 1940s. It definitely took its inspiration from the time period, but this model was actually made around the early 2000s. What about another traditionally inspired flyback chronograph that also has a day, a date, a month, a moon phase complication? This is the reference 031240. Then you find more modern looking pieces, like the El Primero GRANDE full open, that uses a transparent dial, allowing you to observe the movement working in the background. The El Primero STRATOS, a watch worn by Felix Baumgartner, who broke the world record falling from the Red Bull STRATOS module that we saw a few years ago. This piece does look superb. It's great having the complication paired with a rotatable timing bezel as well. It's much more useful than a tachymeter on most days. Let's be honest. And so we arrive at the watch that has both pulled more attention to the brand, but also a watch that seems to have turned up the noses of the purists. The Zenith Defy El Primero. It may not be the easiest watch to read, but the network of how the movement integrates with the mechanics of the case and the elements on the dial, it's the kind of watch that you would have to rotate your wrist just to see the microcosm of parts and how they layer themselves together. The case design is very striking. The choice of finishing and the modern approach of using updated pushers and crowns gives the watch a completely different feel. It is most definitely not what we are accustomed to seeing, but then if we move away from the skeletonized Defy and look at a special edition Defy that was made to celebrate the original A384 on its own, this watch does look like an El Primero. It actually looks terrific. The proportions have been transplanted across to the more modern case, and the result is a watch that shares the same DNA, but also appears radically different. Now, of course, the Defy El Primero appeals to a certain audience. Does its design appeal to me? I'm not someone who enjoys skeletonized movements, and they really only appeal to me when they are easier to read. If the watches used a similar transparent backing to make the watch all the more legible, it would be great. As it appears now, it seems way too jam-packed for my tastes. And just jumping back to the more traditional pieces again, it is unreal to see how far the line has come. More importantly though, what the name El Primero has done and how it has evolved. If there is one improvement that I would like to add to the conventional pieces that we see, it would be this. Return to using a loomed chronograph hand and drop the star counterbalance. 1 star on the dial is more than enough. 2 stars is just greedy. The El Primero has a phenomenal history. And what is important is that the watch stays true to its history, until we move towards the more experimental pieces, of course. What makes it such a phenomenal piece of art is that it manages to exhibit its prowess on both sides. A gorgeous and unique dial on one, and on the other, a movement that is not matched by many. Technicalities and history aside, I don't think many can deny that this is a beautiful watch, and time has not affected its image in the slightest. With those specifics out of the way, with these specifics out of the way, we can now move our focus towards the design of the watch.